I'm Adriana McDonald, 42, and I went from a Marine kid at Camp Lejeune to a colonel commanding Task Force Apex. For years, I protected my younger brother Milton quietly, smoothing his path, taking the hits, letting him believe I was just some desk officer. But when he mocked me as the family pencil pusher in front of his squad, I made one choice that changed everything. I said my call sign. Have you ever been underestimated by someone you gave everything to? Tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to reclaim your worth after being dismissed, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries, betrayal, and standing tall. What happened next might surprise you. My father taught me the ranks the way other fathers teach their kids the alphabet. He used coffee mugs. This was 1990, Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and I was 8 years old sitting at the kitchen table while he lined them up by size on the counter, biggest on the left, smallest on the right, and explained that the biggest one was the one everyone answered to. I asked him which one he was. He tapped the third from the left, a heavy ceramic mug with a chipped handle, and said, "Not yet." I remember thinking I wanted to be the one that wasn't on the table, the one nobody had earned in this house, the one he hadn't gotten to yet. He was a staff sergeant then, Gerald McDonald, 34 years old and working toward Gunnery Sergeant with the methodical patience of a man who understood that the Corps moves on its own schedule and not yours. My mother, Helen, ran the house with the same patience, the practiced, quiet kind that military spouses develop not as resignation, but as discipline. We lived in base housing, neat and identical to every house on either side of us, and I understood from a very early age that order was not something imposed on us. It was something we maintained. There is a difference, and I learned it before I could have explained it. By the time I was 10, I knew every pay grade in the Marine Corps. By the time I was 12, I knew which ones my father would never reach. Not because I thought less of him, I didn't, not for a single day, but because I had learned to read the math of a military career the way you learn to read weather. You look at the conditions and you know what is coming. My father was a good Marine and a good man, and he topped out as a first sergeant, E8, which is exactly as far as most career NCOs with his entry year and MOS could expect to go. He knew it, I knew it, neither of us ever said it, we just understood. What I understood about myself, by around 14, was that I was going to the officer side. Not because I thought I was better than my father, I want to be precise about this, but because I had looked at the table of mugs and I wanted the ones that weren't on it yet. I wanted the ranks he couldn't teach me from personal experience. I wanted to go somewhere he hadn't been. That is not a criticism of him. It is the thing he built in me. And I think he knew it, and I think he was proud of it, even when it cost him something to admit. In October of 1998, my brother Milton was born. I was 16, a junior in high school, and already building my application for NROTC programs. I remember standing in the hospital hallway at Camp Lejeune while my mother slept and my father made phone calls outside, holding this small person who could not understand anything I said to him and telling him that he was lucky. That by the time he figured out what he wanted, someone would have already gone ahead and cleared some of the path. He blinked at the ceiling. He had no opinion. I made him promises anyway, and that, in retrospect, should have told me something about the kind of older sister I was going to be. The kind who protects first and asks permission later. He was 2 hours old, and I was already making him promises he didn't ask for. That should have told me something. In the fall of 2000, I enrolled at Virginia Tech on an NROTC scholarship, Marine option. 4 years, deliberate and focused. I knew what I wanted. The Marine officer track, the infantry-adjacent pipeline, something with an edge to it. I graduated in May of 2004 and was commissioned as a second lieutenant. My father drove up from Jacksonville in his dress blues. He was a first sergeant by then, E8, 30 years in. He saluted me first, which is the custom, an NCO rendering honors to a newly commissioned officer regardless of personal relationship, and I can tell you that I have received salutes from general officers since then in 3 countries, and none of them have ever felt like that one. He saluted me and I could see that it cost him something. Not pride. Pride was easy, and he had plenty of it. It cost him the version of me he understood, the version that was still his to explain. After that, I was his officer, same as anyone else. The mug was on the table now, and the early years of my career are not a secret. I was at the basic school at Quantico in 2004, working through the standard officer pipeline. The Corps, at that point, had been at war for 3 years, and the tempo was visible in everything: the pace of training, the language of the instructors, the fact that everyone around me was preparing for a place they had either already been or were about to go. I was 22 and I had been raised in this institution, and it still surprised me. The weight of it, the realness of it. You can grow up in a military family and understand the vocabulary perfectly and still be surprised by the specific gravity of it when it becomes yours. Milton was 6 years old when I commissioned. He was in first grade and had no idea what any of it meant. I called home when I could, which was not often and not long, and I remember one particular call when he was about 8, a Sunday evening, him on the kitchen phone, Helen in the background, when he asked me very seriously if I had a gun. I told him sometimes. He asked if it was big. I told him big enough. He considered this and told me his friend Tyler's dad was also in the military and had a very big gun, and he thought mine should be bigger. I agreed that mine should probably be bigger. He seemed satisfied with this and handed the phone back to our mother. I sent him a small USMC Globe and Anchor pin around that time. He wore it to school for a week. Helen told me his teacher asked about it, and he told the whole class his sister was in the Marines. I thought about that for a while after she told me. The specific pride of a small boy who wants people to know that someone in his family is doing something that matters. I held on to that. I still hold on to it. The early years of us were phone calls and packages, and the particular presence of someone who shows up consistently from far away. I was the big sister who asked about his grades and sent him things and made sure he knew, across every deployment and classified billet and unmarked office, that I was still there. That was the shape of it. And it was real. It just wasn't the whole picture. By 2008, I was a captain, 03, and my assignments had gone classified. This is not a dramatic thing when it happens. It is mostly administrative. You fill out different paperwork, you stop answering certain questions with anything useful. The specific conversation that marked the turn was one with my mother that Christmas, when she asked what I had been working on. I told her administrative liaison work. She paused for the smallest moment, and then she wrote it on the Christmas card she sent to relatives. The first lie I let stand wasn't Milton's. It was my mother's. She needed something to write on the Christmas card, and I gave her a phrase that fit in a line, and I didn't correct it, and that is where the story of the pencil pusher began. It began as necessity. It was not laziness, and it was not arrogance. I was operating in a classified billet, and the alternative to that phrase was a security violation. So I said the available thing, and it stuck, and over the years it became the fixed version of me that my family carried, the version that fit in a Christmas card line. I told myself it didn't matter. For a long time, it didn't. Gerald retired in 2012. First Sergeant, honorable, 30-plus years. I was 30 years old and a major, 04, assigned to a SOCOM-adjacent staff billet. I could not attend his retirement ceremony because I was overseas, and I sent a letter instead, which he kept. I know he kept it because Helen told me, and I know what it cost him that I wasn't there, and I know he never mentioned it. That is the kind of man he is. You understand something about the shape of a family when you know how it handles the things it never says. Milton was 14 that year, starting to talk about what he wanted after high school. He hadn't said the Marine Corps yet, but I already knew. You grow up in a house that gets into you, and it had gotten into him. The word he would use eventually was real. He wanted to do something real. That word would follow us for a long time. Milton called me in the fall of 2015, a few months before his 18th birthday, to tell me he was planning to enlist. He had been talking to a recruiter, he said. Infantry, Marine Corps. He had an idea about the 0311 MOS, rifleman, which is the straightest line into the infantry and the most Marine thing a Marine can decide to be. He told me this with a specific kind of energy, the energy of someone who has been sitting on a decision and is finally releasing it. And he framed it partly as following in my footsteps and partly as wanting something I had apparently chosen not to want. He said, "I want to do something real, Adriana, not sit behind a desk." I was 33 years old, a lieutenant colonel, 05, in the middle of my second year as deputy commander of what would eventually become Task Force Apex. I had 2 deployments behind me, both classified, and a 3rd rotation on the planning schedule. I said, "Then don't. Just make sure you know what you're signing." I did not tell him that I had already quietly reached out to the recruiter district to confirm his file was complete and accurate. I did not tell him that I had reviewed his contract options informally through a contact I trusted. I smoothed the path before he walked it and said nothing about it, because that is what I had always done with Milton. I arranged things he didn't know needed arranging and presented him with the outcome as though it had arrived on its own. He experienced me as supportive but distant. He had no way to know I was running interference at every step. He was not trying to diminish me when he said the desk comment. He was 17 years old, and he had a fixed picture of his sister's career, the Christmas card version, the administrative liaison version, and he was drawing a contrast between that version and the thing he was about to do. He was proud of himself. He wanted me to be proud of him. The word real was not a weapon. It was just the word he had. I gave him no other word to use. He enlisted in the spring of 2016, 17 years old, with a pre-ship date set for after his birthday that October. He turned 18 and shipped to MCRD Paris Island, and I tracked his training cycle from a classified facility in Virginia the way you track any asset you care about, quietly, from a distance, with consistent attention. I attended his boot camp graduation in June of 2016. He was 18 years old and I was 34. A lieutenant colonel with 12 years of service, 2 deployments, and a classified command billet. I wore civilian clothes. Gerald was in a suit with only his retired pin showing. Helen wore a yellow blouse she had bought specifically for the occasion. Milton graduated and was promoted to private first class on the depot, which is standard, and when he found us in the crowd, he grabbed my shoulders and looked at me with the particular intensity of a young man who has just done the hardest thing he has ever done and wants you to understand its significance. He said, "You should have done this, not the office stuff." He meant it as a compliment. He meant it as an invitation. Here, come stand where I'm standing, see what this is. He said it like he was offering me something I had missed. I had been in the Corps for 12 years at that point. I smiled and told him he looked like a Marine. He did. He absolutely did. And I let the moment be his without complicating it, because that was the right thing to do on that day. And also because I had gotten very good, by then, at letting things be simpler than they were. Over the next several years, the pattern deepened. Milton moved through his early career, Camp Lejeune, a deployment rotation, promotion to Lance Corporal, and then Corporal, and with each step, his understanding of his own identity sharpened. He was the real Marine in the family. He had done the hard physical thing, the infantry thing. His sister worked in D.C. In 2019, he was a corporal, E4, and I was 37 years old and a colonel, 06, 1 year into commanding Task Force Apex. My call sign had become active in 2018, Apex 1. The Marine SOF community knew it. Anyone who had operated under my authority knew it. My brother, sitting across a diner table from me in Jacksonville with 2 of his unit buddies, knew only that his sister worked in D.C. and pushed paper and was, at least, cool. "She's just a desk Marine," he said, and his friends nodded, and I ordered dessert. He was using the story he had, the only story I had given him. But by 2019, I had started to feel the weight of it, in a way I hadn't before. Not anger, more like awareness. Like realizing you have been holding something for a long time and only now noticing that your arm is tired. When I left Jacksonville that day in a rental car, passing through the main gate where the sentry waved me through on my credentials, I didn't look back. I was already thinking about the brief I had to catch in 2 hours. I was good at the transition between worlds. What I didn't always notice was how long it had been since someone from one world had seen me in the other. Milton was promoted to Sergeant E5 in 2020. By 2023, he was assigned to an infantry battalion at Marine Corps Base Quantico, which put him, without either of us planning it, 30 minutes from work I could not describe. In 2022, a gunnery sergeant named Eli Cobb, born 1988, 36 years old by the time of this story, had served his first rotation as a team sergeant under Apex Command in northern Iraq. I did not know him personally before that rotation. I knew his elements file. In January of 2022, his element was in a compound in the Nineveh Governorate when the structure began failing, and I personally authorized the emergency medevac that extracted his people. That is not a dramatic story to tell from where I sit. It was a decision made correctly in the time available. It was my job. He came home. His people came home. By 2023, Cobb had completed a second rotation under Apex Command. By early 2024, he was assigned at Quantico. Milton was at Quantico. I was moving through Quantico regularly. It was only a matter of time. I just didn't know what shape it would take when it arrived. It was a Wednesday, 0800 hours and change, May of 2024. I was 42 years old and 6 years into commanding Task Force Apex, and I was dressed in slacks and a plain blouse with no rank visible anywhere on my person. I had a closed senior leaders brief at the Marine Corps Combat Development Command at 0930 hours, and a flight out of Dulles at 1400 hours, and Milton's battalion area was on the way between the gate and my meeting. I texted him just after 0800. Then I'm on base for a few hours. Want to grab coffee before 0930? He replied within 2 minutes. Yeah, come by the battalion. We're just doing formation stuff. I had been walking into enlisted spaces in civilian clothes for 20 years, so it did not concern me. I thought about the brief, about the agenda items I needed to sequence correctly, about whether I had time to get coffee on the way. I thought about Milton, that he always looked tired on Wednesdays, and I thought it would be good to see him for 15 minutes before I got on a plane. I was not walking in there to make a point. I want to be precise about that. There was no calculation in this visit. There was a brother I wanted to see before a flight, and there was time, and I used it. That is the part I have kept coming back to in the months since. The complete ordinariness of the decision. The fact that nothing about that morning was designed. I found Milton outside the battalion headquarters building just before 0900 hours. His squad was assembled loosely in the area, 6 Marines in the informal cluster of people, waiting for something to start. Milton saw me from maybe 30 feet out, and his face arranged itself into the specific grin he has worn since he was about 12 years old, the one that means he's about to say something he thinks is funny. He opened his mouth before I reached him. Everyone, he said, loud enough to carry. My big sister, the family pencil pusher. His squad laughed. It was the relaxed laugh of people following their sergeant's lead, not the mean laugh of people who have decided something. It was easy laughter, comfortable, the kind that comes from having heard a version of this story before. He turned to me, still grinning, and said, What do they even call you, office lady? Give us a call sign. He was 26 years old. He was proud of his squad, and he wanted them to meet his sister, and he was doing the thing he always did, which was fold me into the version of the story that fit the audience. I had given him that story. I had maintained it for 8 years. I understood, in the moment, that this was not malice. But I had already seen Gunnery Sergeant Eli Cobb. He was standing 1 row back from Milton's squad, holding a paper cup of coffee, and his face had gone very still. Not stiff, still the way a person goes still when they recognize something and are deciding how to respond to it. He had served 2 rotations under my command. He had heard my call sign given in operational briefings in northern Iraq. He knew that the name Apex 1 belonged to someone he did not discuss outside cleared spaces, and he was looking at me across the heads of 6 Marines who were laughing at the office lady joke. I looked past Milton. I found Cobb's eyes, and I said it quietly, just loud enough to carry the distance between us. Apex 1. Cobb put the coffee cup down on the planter ledge to his left without looking at it. He squared his shoulders. He came to attention, full attention, not the casual version, and he rendered a salute with the precision of a man who understood exactly what he was doing and why. Colonel! Ma'am! The laugh died. It didn't fade. It stopped. 6 Marines, none of them moving. Milton's grin was gone. He looked at his gunnery sergeant. He looked at me. He looked at his gunnery sergeant again. The math was arriving in pieces, and I could see it landing. The call sign Cobb had mentioned, apparently more than once, with the specific reverence that Marines reserve for people who pulled their people out. Apex 1, the woman in the plain blouse who his gunny had just come to full attention for. His sister, the pencil pusher, the office lady, the one who didn't have a call sign. I returned the salute. I said, At ease, gunny. I turned to Milton, who had not moved, and I put my hand briefly on his shoulder. 1 pat, nothing more. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to add. I had a brief at 0930 and a flight at 1400, and I turned and walked back to my car. Behind me, the area was quiet. Not the silence before something, the silence after. 6 Marines standing in the morning air recalibrating what they had just seen. I did not look back. I checked my watch. I had 22 minutes to get to MCCDC. I didn't plan that. I walked back to my car, checked my watch, and thought about the brief. The part that surprised me wasn't the salute. It was how quiet the whole area went. Through the rearview mirror, before I turned out of the battalion parking area, Milton was still standing where I'd left him. His squad was a row behind him. None of them were talking. He was doing the thing you do when the frame has shifted and you need a moment before you can move inside the new one. I knew that feeling. I had been doing it, in my own way, for years. I turned onto the road and drove toward my meeting. The brief ran 2 hours. I gave it well, which is not a boast. It is a baseline. You give the brief well, or you don't give it. I covered joint SOF coordination, discussed operational resourcing with 2 general officers, answered a question about CENTCOM integration that required 15 minutes of careful language, and walked out of MCCDC at 11:50 hours into a May morning that was warm and smelled like cut grass and jet exhaust. Quantico, in spring. I had been coming to this base for 20 years, and it still smelled the same. I drove to Dulles. I parked. I checked my phone in the terminal for the first time since the parking lot at Milton's battalion. Nothing from him. I had not expected anything. It was too soon. And Milton is not the kind of person who processes quickly in public, but I checked anyway, which told me something about what I was tracking underneath the professionalism. I gave a 2-hour brief on joint SOF coordination and answered questions from a room full of general officers. Then I sat at the gate and checked my phone. He hadn't texted. I closed the phone and drank my coffee. I have gotten very good at compartmentalizing. It is not a skill I developed deliberately. It was required by the work, and so it became automatic, the way all survival adaptations do. You close a door and you move into the next room. On the flight home, I read a classified summary I had been carrying, ate a package of pretzels, and thought about nothing that had happened that morning. By the time I landed, I was home, and the door was still closed. I opened it that evening. The next morning, Thursday, the day after Quantico, Lieutenant Colonel Renata Vasquez called me. Ren, born 1983, 41 years old, currently serving in a SOCOM-adjacent billet at the Pentagon. We had known each other since 2010, which is long enough to have skipped most of the formality. She had heard a version of the story already. The Quantico network is small and specific, and interesting stories move through it quickly. She asked what happened. I told her in the order it occurred without editorializing. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "That's the most Marine story I've ever heard." I laughed. It was brief. Then I said, "He didn't know, Ren. He genuinely didn't know." There was a different quality to the silence after that. That is the thing I was sitting with. Not embarrassment. The public moment didn't embarrass me, or if it did, it was not the primary thing. What I was sitting with was the recognition that I had built the conditions for that morning myself. Over 8 years, one maintained a mission at a time. Milton was not wrong to believe the story. I had handed him the story and never replaced it with anything real. The pencil pusher did not emerge from his imagination. It emerged from the only version of me I had made available to him, for reasons that began as legitimate and stayed past their expiration date. On Friday morning, second day without word from him, I worked from home. Correspondence, a video coordination call with my Apex element, the usual administrative weight of running a classified joint command. In the evening, I found myself looking at a photograph on my desk. Milton in his dress blues at his promotion ceremony from 2020, Corporal to Sergeant, E4 to E5. He looked the way you look when you've earned something, and you know it. Straight spine, no performance, just the quiet satisfaction of a person who has done the work and been recognized for it. What he didn't know was that I had helped him with his dress blue trousers for that ceremony. His issued pair hadn't fit correctly, and the Marine Corps exchange at his base didn't have the right cut in his size. And he had mentioned it in passing on a phone call. Not as a request, just as a frustration. He never knew I ordered the trousers. He thought the Marine Corps exchange had the right size. They didn't. I just found the right place and had them shipped. It was a small thing. There were a lot of small things. That is the part of the imbalance that doesn't show up in the public version of the story. Not just that he didn't know what I had done professionally, but that he didn't know what I had done for him. I had been running interference in his life for 20 years, and he experienced all of it as luck or coincidence or the Corps just working the way it was supposed to work. I had built that invisibility deliberately because I thought it was more generous than taking credit. By Friday evening, I was not as sure about that as I used to be. Helen called that evening. She had heard a version from Milton. He had called her before he called me, which said something about the order in which he processed things. She asked what happened. I gave her a shorter version than I had given Wren. When I finished, she was quiet in the way she has been quiet my whole life. Not empty, just waiting to be sure the moment was right before she used words. She said, "I always knew you let him believe what he believed. I just never pushed." I said, "I know, Mom." We talked for a while after that about Gerald's knee and a cousin's graduation, and the conversation moved sideways, the way our family's conversations always move when they have touched something true. After the call, I sat in the kitchen for a while. My phone was on the table. Milton's name was in the recent calls list, sitting there from the day he had called Helen. Not from any call to me. I did not call him. He needed time to find the words, and I knew that about him, and so I gave him what he needed without being asked, the way I had always given him things without being asked, and I went to bed. He called at 08:14 on Saturday morning, 3 days after Quantico. I knew it was him before I picked up, not because of anything mystical, but because I had been waiting, and his name was the one I was watching for. And there it was. He started with, "Hey," a pause that lasted long enough to mean something. And then, "I owe you an apology." I said, "I know. Go ahead." He is 26, and he does not have the practiced language of someone who apologizes easily or often. He found the words anyway. He said that he had been calling me a pencil pusher for years, to his Marines, to his friends, to people in passing, and that he hadn't known what he didn't know, and that he was sorry. He said it plainly, without decoration. He was embarrassed. I could hear it not in his voice, but in the pacing of his sentences, the small hesitations where he was choosing between the true thing and the easier version, and choosing the true thing each time. I respected that. It is not a small thing to do. His apology was genuine and also incomplete. He was apologizing for the mockery, for the Wednesday morning, for the squad, for the phrase, "office lady." But he didn't fully understand yet the shape of what he had been missing. Not just that I outranked him, not just that his gunny had served under my command, the whole architecture of the 20 years. I was going to give him that. Within the limits of what I could say, I was going to give him the structure. I told him the outline. I told him I commissioned in 2004, that I went into special operations billets, that my assignments had been classified for most of my career, that I commanded a joint element under SOCOM, and that Apex 1 was my call sign, and had been for 6 years. I didn't give him operational details. There are things I will never be able to give him. But I gave him the architecture, and I let it land, and I could hear it landing in his breathing, the specific silence of someone recalculating a very large number. I told him what I could. I left out what I had to. But I gave him enough that the structure was clear. He was quiet for a long time after that. He was quiet for a while, and then briefly he pushed back. Not hard, he wasn't angry, but the defensive instinct surfaced, the way it does when someone realizes they have been wrong in a sustained way and needs a moment to locate an explanation that isn't entirely their fault. He said, "Why didn't you just say something?" I told him the truth. Because my assignments required it. Because the family would have worried. Because I made a choice early for legitimate reasons, and it became a habit before I examined it carefully enough to know it had become one. I told him, "I'm not blaming you for not knowing what I didn't tell you, but I'm done being the pencil pusher." He went quiet, then after a moment, "Okay. Just okay." It was enough. After we hung up, I texted Wren. He called. We talked. I told him the outline. She replied with one word, "Good," and I made a second cup of coffee and stood at my kitchen window and tried to identify what I was feeling. It wasn't relief yet. Relief takes longer than a single conversation. What it was, what I can name now with some distance from it, was the absence of a weight I had been carrying so long I had stopped registering it as separate from myself. Relief didn't come right away. What came first was just quiet, the kind you notice because you're not used to it. My second coffee sat on the kitchen counter, steaming while I stood at the window. I did not check my phone. I watched the morning do nothing in particular outside the glass, and I let it. In the weeks after the call, Milton began the slow, private work of recalibrating. I know this not from watching it directly, but from what I put together later. From what he told me, from what Helen told me, from the quality of the silences in his unit that he described in pieces over the following months, he did not spiral. He is not that kind of person. But the thing he had built, the identity of being the real Marine in the family, the one who had done the hard thing, had been complicated in a way that required adjustment, and he made the adjustment the way most 26-year-old Marines make adjustments. Quietly, practically, and without asking for help until he had to. The days after the salute were quiet in his unit in a specific way. Nobody piled on. That is not how the Corps works for the most part. The institution has a natural sense of when a person has already received the message and doesn't need it delivered again. His squad stopped laughing at the desk job joke. They didn't make a production of it. They just stopped, and in a room of enlisted Marines, that absence is louder than anything they could have said. Nobody piled on. That's not how the Corps works, mostly. They just stopped laughing at the desk job joke, and in a room of sergeants, that absence is louder than anything they could have said. He is the sergeant whose gunnery sergeant saluted his sister. That is the math they are all living with now. Gies and Cobb handled it the way I would have expected him to handle it, with discipline and restraint. When Milton's squad members asked questions, and some of them did, Cobb said only, "Above my pay grade." That phrase, in that context, is its own kind of information. It means real, cleared, do not press. He did not elaborate. He did not protect Milton from the weight of it. He also did not add to it. He simply held his own ground and let the situation breathe. Milton caught him after formation one evening, late May, and asked him directly. "How long have you known who she is?" Cobb told him. 2 years, 2 rotations under Apex command. Northern Iraq, 2022, a compound in the Nineveh Governorate, a structure failing faster than anyone had planned for. He said that Apex 1 personally authorized the emergency medevac. He said his element had gotten out because of that decision and the speed with which it was made. He said he had never used her name outside cleared spaces, not once, but that he had thought about it. He looked at Milton and said, "Your sister brought my people home." Milton nodded once and walked away. He did not respond immediately. That is also how he processes. He takes the information and goes somewhere quiet with it, and when he comes back, he has already decided what to do with it. He called Helen not long after. Not to talk about me specifically, at least that's how it started, but I came up, the way I always seem to come up in family conversations eventually. Helen had already had her own quiet conversation with me by that point. She listened to Milton describe what Cobb had told him. She said, "I'm not surprised." He asked if she had known. She said she knew he wasn't pushing paper. She just knew she couldn't say what she was actually doing. He asked why nobody had told him. She said, "She didn't ask anyone to. That's who she is." That is accurate. I had never asked anyone to maintain my cover story within the family. I hadn't needed to. The story had maintained itself because I kept providing just enough detail to satisfy without providing anything real. In my own professional life during those weeks, nothing changed. The Quantico morning did not transform my work or my command. My Apex element did not know what had happened with Milton. It was not relevant to the mission. I sat at my desk in a secure facility and reviewed operational planning and attended coordination calls and did the work the same way I had always done it. What changed was only in the private lane. The next time my mother asked what I was working on, I said I cannot tell you the details, but it matters, and I left it there. I did not offer the administrative liaison line. I did not replace one simplification with another. Nothing changed at work. The mission doesn't care about family dynamics. But I noticed that the next time my mother asked what I was working on, I said, "I can't tell you the details, but it matters," and I left it there. That was new. I closed a classified planning document one evening in June, locked my workstation, picked up my jacket, and walked out into the open air before I checked my personal phone. That too was new, a small shift in the sequencing that I noticed because I had not expected to notice it. The work was still the work. The lines between it and the rest of my life were just getting a little cleaner. The repair between Milton and me was not a single event. It did not arrive at a particular moment and announce itself as complete. It was a series of smaller moments accumulated over weeks, each one slightly less awkward than the last, each one slightly more honest. That is how repairs actually work between people who are not performing their relationship for an audience. You don't reconcile, you just gradually stop maintaining the distance. He texted me a few weeks after the call. No message, just a photograph of his rifle range qualification scores, shot at the 500-yard line. He sent it without context, and I looked at it and texted back. "That's a good group at 500. He said thanks. Then after a pause, he said, "I didn't know what else to send." I wrote back, "This works." It did work. It was exactly the right size for where we were. He didn't know how to reestablish contact without the old dynamic, the ribbing, the teasing, the easy shorthand of a relationship built on a simplified story. And so he sent something real. His actual work, his actual scores, the thing he was actually doing. I received it correctly because I knew what it cost him to reach, and this was the way he knew how to do it, and it was enough. I was back at Quantico in mid-June for a follow-up coordination meeting. We met for lunch, just the two of us, at a diner off base. He asked me questions he had never asked before. How do you get into that kind of work? What does commanding a joint element actually mean day to day? Do you ever miss being in the field? I answered what I could. I also asked him real questions. What did he want after his current enlistment? Where did he want to go? He sat with this for a moment. It is not a question he gets asked often, I suspect. And then he said he had been thinking about raider selection. I told him that was a serious thing to want and to be serious about preparing for it. Not a yes, not a no, not an offer to help or a warning against trying. Just be serious because it requires seriousness, and if you bring seriousness to it, then the rest is possible. He nodded. We talked about Gerald's knee for a while and about a movie he had watched twice and couldn't explain why, and when we said goodbye in the parking lot, it was the goodbye of two people who have found a new way to be in the same conversation. I asked him what he wanted. He actually told me. That was new for both of us. In late June, Wren and I had dinner in Arlington. She asked where things stood with Milton, and I told her. Better, not fixed, better. I told her what I had figured out in the weeks since, that I had been managing my brother the same way I managed classified information. Need-to-know basis, controlled release, distributed carefully, reviewed for sensitivity before sharing. I had applied a professional framework to a personal relationship without ever noticing I was doing it. I managed him the way I manage classified material, need-to-know controlled release. The problem was, he's my brother, not a mission asset. The result was a brother who had no access to the real version of his sister because I had decided, instinctively and without examining the decision, that the real version was on a need-to-know basis, and his need had never risen to the level that would unlock it. Wren said that was the most therapist answer she had ever heard me give. I told her I wasn't seeing a therapist. She said she knew. That was the problem. We paid the check and walked out into the Arlington evening, and I thought about what she said for the next 3 days. Helen called again in late June with a piece of information she delivered in her sideways way, embedded in the middle of a conversation about something else. Milton had started asking her questions about my early career, about what I was like in high school, about what Gerald had thought when I commissioned. He's trying to understand you, she said. I told her, I know, let him. She said, I always let him. You were the one I waited on. It was not an accusation. It was a mother being accurate. She had watched both of her children for 42 years, and she was simply naming what she saw. I sat in my home office after that call for a long moment. On my desk, visible behind the papers and the lamp and the secure phone, was my commissioning photograph from 2004. 22 years old, brand new second lieutenant's bars on my shoulders. I didn't look at the photograph. I already knew what it said. Late August of 2024, 42 years old. 90 days, roughly, from the Quantico morning. My life, from the outside, looked identical to what it had been in April. Same billet, same mission, same rank, same 5-mile run before the workday began. I run the same route I have run since my first posting that required early mornings and a body that could do what the job asked of it. 5 miles, same start, same turns, same finish. The route doesn't change. What changes is what you think about on it. 3 months out from Quantico, I was running an after action in my head. Same as always, different subject. The answer to what I would do differently was specific and small. I would have found a way to tell Milton something real, earlier. Not everything, that was never possible. Not the operational details, not the classified work, not the names or places or decisions that live in a compartment that will close when I retire and stay closed. But the architecture, the outline, The same thing I gave him in May, which took 20 minutes and cost nothing in terms of security and everything in terms of honesty. I would have done that earlier. Not because he deserved it as a performance of my achievements, but because he deserved to know his sister. Those are different reasons, and only one of them is right. In August, Milton sent me a screenshot by text. No message, just the image. His application to Raider Battalion selection submitted. I looked at it for a moment and texted back. Good. Now work, he replied. Already am. I put the phone down and went back to what I was doing. He did not ask me to pull strings. He did not ask if I knew anyone who could help. He submitted the application and told me he was already working, which is the only correct answer. Raider selection doesn't care whose sister you are. It cares about what you can sustain. The fact that he showed me the application without asking for anything was the clearest signal he had sent me since the phone call. I understand now what kind of work it is, and I am treating it accordingly. He didn't ask me to pull strings. He didn't ask me if I knew anyone. He sent the application and said he was already working. That was the right answer. That was the only right answer. I had lunch with Diane Okafor in August. Brigadier General, retired, born 1970, 54 years old. My former commanding officer from the predecessor element to Task Force Apex when I was a major, now consulting in the D.C. area. We have kept a quarterly lunch since she retired because she is one of 3 people in my professional life who know enough of the full picture to be genuinely useful in conversation. And because I trust her judgment in the specific way you trust someone who has watched you make decisions under pressure and not looked away. I told her the Quantico story. She listened without interrupting, which is a discipline she has always had and which I have always appreciated. When I finished, she set down her water glass and said, "You waited a long time to stop being invisible to your own family." I told her I hadn't known I was invisible. I thought I was just quiet. She said, "Same thing, eventually." That landed the way things land when they are true, and you already knew them, and hearing them out loud is just the final step of knowing. I have spent my career being quiet about the right things for the right reasons. It is a necessary skill. What I had not noticed or had noticed and not examined was that discretion, maintained long enough and broadly enough, becomes indistinguishable from disappearance. I had been discreet with my family for so long that I had made myself invisible to them, and I had told myself that invisibility was the same thing as not burdening them, and that was not accurate. At the end of August, closing out a late workday in my home office, I found myself sitting with a question I had not fully formed yet. Not what happened and not what changed, I knew the answers to those, but something harder. Whether the woman who had come through the Quantico morning and the phone call and the lunch and the slow repair was the woman who had always been there, just unseen, or whether she was a slightly different version. I keep coming back to something I can't quite answer yet. Whether what Cobb's salute revealed was just my rank, or whether it revealed something else. Something I'd kept classified even from myself. I didn't answer it that night. I noted it. I turned off my monitor and sat in the quiet room while the evening came in through the window, and I did not check my phone. The question would be there tomorrow. The question was always going to be there. The point was to stop being afraid of what the answer might require. My computer screen went dark. The room was quiet. I realized I had not checked my phone in 2 hours, and I did not check it. By late September of 2024, Milton called on Sunday afternoons. This was new. He had not been a phone call person before. Our contact had run mostly through text, the occasional group call at Christmas, the logistical communications of 2 people who love each other, but have not had much to actually say. Now he called on Sunday afternoons and talked about what he was training for and what he was reading and what he was thinking, and I listened and asked questions, and the conversations lasted longer than either of us planned for. He called in late September and described his preparation for Raider selection in the precise, practical language of a Marine who has thought carefully about what the process requires. PT regimen, land navigation work on weekends, MARSOC history and doctrine he was reading on his own time. He talked about it the way I used to talk about my own preparation, not to impress, but to think out loud with someone who would understand the details. Then he asked me what I had found hardest about the selection process. I paused. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I recognized what the question was. It was the first time he had asked me about my actual career track, as though he expected a real answer, as though he had recalibrated his understanding of what kind of information I was in possession of and had decided to ask for it. I told him, the psychological components, not the physical. Knowing your own limits honestly, without padding them with ego or pride or the version of yourself you want to believe in. The physical is hard, and the physical is survivable. What selection finds what it is designed to find is who you are when the comfortable version of yourself is no longer available. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Yeah, that makes sense." No performance, no posturing, just, "That makes sense," absorbed into a body of knowledge he was building carefully, one piece at a time. He asked me what was hardest, and I realized I had been waiting for that question for a long time without knowing I was waiting for it. Not for him to ask about selection specifically, for him to ask me something that assumed I had an answer worth hearing. In October, I visited home in Jacksonville for the first time in over a year. Gerald's knee had gotten worse, and Helen had stopped mentioning it in a way that meant it was more serious than she was saying, and I cleared a weekend and drove down. The house on the cul-de-sac was the same house they had lived in since Gerald retired, neat and permanent, the kind of house that has settled into itself over 30 years and stopped trying to be anything other than what it is. Gerald was at the table when I got there, upright, telling Helen a story about a Liberty incident from 1987 that I had heard, conservatively, 15 times. She laughed at the same part she always laughed at. Milton was already there when I arrived, in civilian clothes, relaxed in the particular way of a person who has nothing to prove in this room. We ate, Gerald talked, Helen refilled things. Milton and I argued briefly and affectionately about a piece of land navigation doctrine, and Gerald listened to this with the expression of a man who had raised one Marine and watched another one happen, and was quietly satisfied with both outcomes. At some point, Gerald raised his glass. He looked at me with the specific expression of a retired first sergeant who has been in long enough to understand what a career like mine actually costs. Not in abstraction, but in the specific currency of years and separations and things you cannot say at the dinner table. He said simply, "To the Colonel." Milton raised his glass. Helen raised hers. I looked at my father, 68 years old with a bad knee and 30-plus years of service behind him, and the specific dignity of a man who built something he couldn't fully see from where he stood, and I said, "You already saluted me once, Dad. Don't oversell it." The table laughed, real laughter, the kind that comes from a room that is actually comfortable. I looked at Milton across the table and he was grinning, not the grin from outside Battalion HQ, not the performance grin, but the real one, the one that means something landed right, and I thought, this is what it was supposed to look like. Not the version we had before, which was warm, but built on a fiction. This version, built on what's actually true. I passed through Quantico in October for a coordination meeting, and I saw Cobb in a corridor near the battalion area. He came to a brief halt, respectful, not stiff, the bearing of a man who knows exactly where he is in a hierarchy and is comfortable there. I told him quietly that I had heard what he told my brother. He said, "It was just the truth, Colonel." I said, "I know. Thank you." He nodded once and continued on. The entire exchange was 12 seconds. It said everything it needed to say. Cobb did not salute me that morning in May to help me win a moment. He saluted me because he recognized his commanding officer and rendered the appropriate military courtesy. Full stop. And when Milton came to him later and asked what it meant, Cobb told him the truth because the truth was available to him, and he is the kind of Marine who does not withhold it from someone who needs it. That is all. There was no strategy in any of it. There was just a woman who said her call sign, and a gunnery sergeant who had served under her, and a brother who had been working with the wrong information for a very long time. In the evenings now I work, and then I close the door, and the rest of it is the rest of it. I call Milton on Sunday when he doesn't call first. I tell my mother it matters without telling her what it is. I have lunch with Okafor. I run the same 5 miles. Nothing about my professional life changed. Everything about the private lane is a little more honest. I didn't set out to prove anything that morning. I just said my call sign. And the thing that happened after, the quiet, the salute, the 3 days, the call, the lunch, the dinner, all of that was just what was waiting on the other side of a fiction I had been too careful to correct. I didn't walk away from something. I just stopped maintaining a distance that had started as a necessity and stayed past its purpose. That's not a lesson. That's just what happened when I finally let the room know who was in it. In the corner of my desk, there's a command photograph I have not yet hung. Task Force Apex, 2022, Northern Iraq. Cobb's element is in the third row. I am in the center. I don't look different from anyone else in the frame. I am just the one they all faced. I turn off the desk lamp most evenings and the photograph stays where it is, unhung, half visible in the dark, and I leave it there because I haven't decided yet where it belongs on the wall. I have time, the work is ongoing, the story is not a lesson, and it is not finished, and that is exactly right. You don't have to announce yourself. You just have to stop pretending you aren't there. Sometimes the hardest truth to face is that silence can protect you, but it can also make you disappear. Would you have revealed the truth sooner, or stayed quiet like Adriana did? Was Milton wrong for believing the version of her she allowed him to see? And have you ever had to prove your worth to someone who should have known better? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story hit home, like, subscribe, and stay with us for more true stories about respect, family, and reclaiming your voice.